The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 10.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For the last 3 lectures, we have been in contemporary philosophy, studying the pragmatists, the positivists, and the analysts. These schools represent the pro-reason, pro-logic schools of contemporary philosophy. Whatever they say, they do not overtly denounce reason. They claim to be the champions of reason and science. And this is true of the pragmatists, the positivists, and the analysts. Nevertheless, of course, if you abstract from the differences among these various schools and ask what you find as far as their actual attitude to reason is as it emerges from their particular views, you find 2 particular interrelated tenets thrust at you from all directions in these 3 movements. One of these tenets is the severing of reason from reality, and the second, the conclusion that reason is not a sufficient or adequate guide to enable one to live one's life. And let us look briefly at each of these points. As to the first point, namely that these various schools that we've been studying the last few weeks sever reason from reality. That's obvious in the case of pragmatism. As we saw, the pragmatists abandon hope on principle of acquiring knowledge of reality. They deny the very concept of external facts of reality independent of us. They claim there can be no certainty, no absolute. They attack the whole subject-object distinction, the distinction between a consciousness in here, which is attempting to know a reality out there. And reason for the pragmatist school, instead of being a faculty for grasping and identifying the nature of some external reality, becomes instead a device for manipulating a plastic, malleable world in accordance with man's subjective purposes. The reasonable comes out as whatever works, which means ultimately whatever satisfies subjective human feelings, whether of an individual or a group. If you ask a pragmatist, well, how are things really? He will tell you that on his philosophy such a question is not only unanswerable, but unaskable. For the positivist mentality, we have a variation of this severing of reason from reality. Logic, if you recall, is essentially a game we play with words, and we could have played a different game if we wanted to. Logic simply consists of analytic propositions, and analytic propositions, remember, are nothing but linguistic conventions, or the expressions of linguistic conventions. And on the positivists, for the positivists, as far as synthetic propositions are concerned, which are allegedly factual propositions, you can never be certain of them. You can never claim any of them as an absolute. For the later analysts, the ordinary language analysts, reason, as far as its use in philosophy at least, means speaking as ordinary people do. The standard of reason is not facts of reality, but how people talk. In consequence, from all these different movements, in consequence of this widespread severing of reason from reality, you find the conclusion, the second point I mentioned, that reason is no longer regarded as a sufficient guide to tell an individual how to live his life. All of these schools progressively whittled away what had once been the province of philosophy, namely to give you a picture of the world and tell you how to live. You recall that they all, in various ways, attacked metaphysics. That area became closed to reason. With the positivists and their emotivist theory of value, you remember the view that value judgments are simply emotive ejaculations, the whole value realm of philosophy, ethics, politics, aesthetics, becomes closed to reason. We have a progressive abdication of philosophy as we go from the pragmatists to the positivists, and of course we reach the jackpot, the climax of this trend with the later analysts. because with their view, even epistemology goes as a subject of philosophy. Philosophy as such becomes simply a disease caused by misinterpretation of ordinary language, and when we become completely clear and all the flies fly out of the fly bottle, that will be the end. Which means, of course, that for these schools, reason gives us no guidance whatever as to how to live in any fundamental philosophic area. Now the upshot, the resultant of this, is that reason loses any of the bases of its authority over human life which it had previously had. It doesn't bring us awareness of reality. It doesn't give us the guidance needed to live. Reason has now been pushed off the scene of human life altogether. This, notice, by the people who claim to be the arch advocates of reason. Meanwhile, the philosophers, as they were progressively retreating from concern with reality and life, as they were in their ivory towers, busy severing philosophy from life and reality, turning it into a technical pastime, arguing over version 5 or version 7 of the verifiability principle, or the status of propositions like the author of Waverley was Scotch, or the unicorn doesn't exist, or busy watching G.E. Moore put up his hands. As they were abandoning, in other words, all consideration for issues of life on earth, the world was going to hell. I don't have to tell you the story of this century. You know the progression of hot and cold wars, of mass slaughter, of anxiety, hysteria, and chaos that progressively characterize the century in which we live. Well, the question arises, who is to deal with these urgent issues of man's actual life? Who is to solve the problems of human life? The so-called advocates of reason have abdicated. Well, you should see that the time is now ripe for a school of men to arise whose theme and main thesis will be, reason has had its chance and has failed. If reason doesn't give us knowledge of reality, something else will. If reason doesn't teach us how to live, well, we don't have to worry because we will find a non-rational source of guidance. So you will expect to witness against this background the rise of overt, avowed anti-reason, not just by implication in the way it was for the pragmatists, the positivists, and the analysts, but now in an avowed, explicit irrationalism. And the school that takes this line is our concern for this evening, the existentialists. Now a few introductory words about the main figures in this movement. Usually 3 men in the 19th century are regarded by existentialists as the main founders or precursors of this movement. One is the novelist Dostoevsky. He is by no means a typical existentialist, and it's somewhat anachronistic to call him an existentialist, but he wrote a very famous work called Notes from Underground, which is one of the major texts of the existentialist movement, and many of the key themes of later existentialism come to prominence in that work, and for that reason, among others, he is regarded as one of the main sources of existentialism. I will be reading you some passages from that work in a moment. A second 19th century figure is Søren Kierkegaard. I'll spell that one for you. K-I-E-R-K-E-G-A-A-R-D, Søren Kierkegaard. He's the first half of the 19th century, 1813 to 1855. He was in his day a minor Danish irrationalist that almost no one had heard of, but he was unearthed and made much of in the 20th century and is now regarded as a very influential philosopher. And the third one, we'll say something about him also this evening. The third one from the 19th century that's normally included is Nietzsche. Now, I will not comment on Nietzsche this evening. We've already covered him, and you will not have much difficulty seeing why existentialists pick him as one of their sources when you hear the tenets of existentialism. You can guess that it will be the pronounced irrationalist, voluntarist, romanticist elements in Nietzsche that they are attracted to. In the 20th century, the main existentialists are three, actually. Two in Germany, Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers, that's with a J, and in France, Jean-Paul Sartre. There is also lesser figures who are on the borderland between literary figures and minor philosophic satellites of the existentialist movement, like Camus, Marcel, Simone de Beauvoir, and so on. And there are sundry religionists and sundry non-objectivist artists included, but the main ones, the ones we'll look at in the 20th century, are Heidegger, to give you a taste of German existentialism, and Sartre, to give you a taste of French existentialism. Now, this movement of existentialism is now at the height of its influence. Sartre was primarily responsible for its rise to prominence as a popular movement, a phenomenon which took place right around World War II, during and after World War II. Today, if you look at the philosophic scene, you will find variations of existentialism largely dominating contemporary Europe. It's very strong in Asia and South America, and it is on the rise in the United States. If you go to a philosophy department in a prestigious university today, if it's a non-prestigious one, it'll have some more old-fashioned people in it still, but if you go to a prestigious university today, you will find that two wings, typically, that characterize the department, the two divisions into which professional philosophers fall, are the analysts and the existentialists. Many of them maintain that these are the two alternatives confronting a philosopher, and he must make up his mind, is he going to be an analyst type or an existentialist type? Needless to say, they have a very, very low estimate of each other. The analysts, the existentialists regard the analysts as trivial word choppers. The analysts regard the existentialists as lunatics. Both of these are correct. But we have looked at one of these two, namely the analysts, and tonight we're going to look at their rivals, the existentialists. Now, first let me give you some general characteristics of existentialism as a whole before we begin to look at particular figures. To begin with, existentialists are strongly opposed to system building in philosophy, as are the analysts and as were many other schools of contemporary philosophy. They are opposed to the idea that philosophy begins by specifying basic premises and by systematically deriving conclusions in an orderly way, with the metaphysics and epistemology and then an ethics derivative from that and then a politics derivative from that. That whole approach to philosophy is out as far as they're concerned. That would be a rational approach to philosophy, and they are irrationalist. They are tireless in saying that existentialism does not consist of any specific body of ideas whatever. They say repeatedly there is no set of propositions which you could define and then establish and prove which constitutes existentialism. And they point frequently to the enormous differences between the various people called existentialists. And of course, on one level, there are many differences among them. For instance, there are devoutly religious existentialists, and there are passionately atheistic existentialists, and there's many other differences of that order. And therefore, most of them have repudiated the label of existentialist. They do not like labels as such. I say all that as a general disclaimer at the outset, but in spite of it all, we can borrow a term of Wittgenstein and say that there are certain family resemblances among the existentialists that we can pick out in a general way at the outset. Basic to all of them, in one form or another, is the tenet that existence, reality, cannot be grasped by reason. Existence cannot be grasped by reason. Existence, as they put it, is dense, opaque, irrational, unintelligible, incomprehensible, absurd. A favorite word of theirs, absurd. It is not accessible to the mind, to the intellect, to science, to logic, to reason. Well, why do they hold this? Now, observe that I'm going to give you some reasons as to why reason is inadequate. Well, first of all, as is always the case in contemporary philosophy, to understand a development in contemporary philosophy, you must go back to Kant. Kant, if you recall, and by now you should have this instilled into your bones, had maintained that existence in itself, true reality, is unknowable to reason. For Kant, reason knows only clusters of sense data, clusters of subjective sense data strung together or joined together by subjective mind-contributed categories. The noumenal world for him, remember, true reality is unknowable in reason. But if you also remember, Kant had said that although we can't know the noumenal world in reason, we can have faith in aspects of it. Remember, we could have faith in God, freedom, and immortality. And on what basis could we have faith? Well, we have a certain sense, a certain feeling. Remember, the feeling of duty, the feeling of moral obligation. And to make sense of this feeling, argued Kant, we need God, freedom, and immortality in the noumenal world. So Kant established a basic split. Reason, for Kant, is the faculty which knows subjective sense data, subjectively organized. Faith gives us insight into true reality, governed or guided by certain fundamental feelings that we have. Well, this Kantian split is precisely the way in which contemporary philosophy as a whole split. It split on these Kantian lines. The pragmatist, positivist, analyst axis took one side. They dropped the noumenal world, as we've seen, and said, all we know are strings of subjectively connected sense data. The existentialists take the other side. Reason, they say, and here they agree with Kant, is superficial. It doesn't go to the heart of things. If we want to know true reality, we need some non-rational faculty, some version of faith, mysticism, feeling. So you can think of the existentialists at the outset as the Kantians who are trying to get to the noumenal world. And they often say that Kant was the first existentialist. They themselves say that, and in the sense they mean it, he was. Because he offered human beings the choice, either you go by reason or you know existence. It's either or, but not both. Concern for reason misses out existence. Concern for existence requires you to repudiate reason. Well, the existentialists are the Kantians who chose the existence side of that dichotomy. And you see why they're called existentialists, therefore. They're the neo-Kantians who chose existence and interpreted that to mean we must therefore abandon reason. Now, of course, they say, as most irrationalists today say, that science is fine for surface, practical truths, but if we want real metaphysical insight, science is unsatisfactory. That's one way you get to existentialism, simply via the development from Kant. But we can approach the emergence of existentialism from still another way. From the theory of universals, the theory of the nature of concepts, which you've seen come up in many different contexts throughout this course. Reason, you know, is the faculty that works by means of concepts. It holds its knowledge in conceptual form. To know by reason is to know conceptually. If it were the case that concepts did not give us knowledge of reality, if concepts were somehow cut off from reality, then of course it would follow that reason was cut off from reality. Since it's the conceptual faculty, reason would have been invalidated. Well, why wouldn't concepts reach reality? What theory would lead you to the view that concepts are cut off from reality? Well, many different theories led systematically to this conclusion. Consider for a moment the classic realist position on universals, which I outlined in the very opening lecture of this course. And here I mean both the Platonic and, by implication, also even the Aristotelian form of it. It's common for these traditional realists in the theory of universals to say that reason, concepts know only universals. And universals stand for what's common to particulars. They don't give us any one particular, they stand for the common denominators. Consequently, on this view, concepts only give us an awareness of what's common to particulars. When you think of manness, for instance, that concept or universal, you don't think of any particular individual. You don't think of Socrates or Plato or Plotinus or Tom, Dick, or Harry. You ignore all individuality. You ignore everything unique about every particular that comes under it, and you simply focus on the common denominators, the common traits. And this, they claim, was true of every concept. If you have the concept triangularity, that tells you nothing about the size or color, etc., of any particular triangle. It merely focuses on the properties common to all. In other words, it was common for these traditional realists to say, concepts do not give you an awareness of individuality. They don't grasp the uniqueness of any particular thing. And therefore, as far as things are individual or unique, to that extent they can't be grasped by concepts or by reason. And this was a very common traditional view. The extreme and most obvious example of it is in the Platonists. For them, as you know, reason studies a world of universals, which is knowable precisely because it's a world of universals. It can't acquire knowledge of the particulars in this world. Concepts are directed to a supernatural world of universals and can't, by their very nature, know this world of particular, unique individuals. Now I have here a nice statement of this point from a philosopher outlining this traditional view. This is from Professor Stace in his Hegelian period, and he summarizes very clearly why, from his point of view, concepts do not get at particulars, a view which he agrees with. Quote, now, he is not an existentialist, but you'll see this is the sort of thing that sets it up for existentialists. Quote, we can know nothing whatever of any object except the concepts which apply to it. No matter what we say of an object, what we say consists in asserting that such and such a concept applies to it. For whatever we say is a word, and every word stands for a concept. I say that this object before me is a white, oblong, soft, material, solid, useful thing called paper. All these predicates are concepts. But if such is the nature of my knowledge of the paper, what is the paper itself? A concept is not a particular thing. It is a general class. It is a universal. All I can know of the paper is that such and such universals or concepts apply to it. Or in other words, that it belongs to such and such general classes. Then what is it? It belongs to various classes, but there must, one would think, which he's going to deny, be a something which belongs to these classes. Just as in order to have motion, one supposes there must be something to move. Well, what is this it apart from the classes to which it belongs? Obviously, if there is any it, we cannot know it. It must remain forever unknowable to us. For all our knowledge is conceptual, i.e. is a knowledge of classes. Therefore, anything apart from classes, such as this alleged it, cannot be known. Unquote. Now he proceeds, I won't take you into his world, but he proceeds to deny the it. There is no it, there are no particulars on his view, there's no concrete, unique individuals at all, on the grounds that if there were any, they would be unknowable, since our means of knowledge is conceptual and concepts only give us universals. Well, that is a kind of extreme statement of an element that was in the whole traditional approach to the theory of concepts. And you see, it is a setup for the existentialists. Because they simply walk in and they say, if concepts cannot know particulars, then they cannot know existence. Because existence is comprised of individuals. It consists of particulars. If concepts miss out particularity, they miss out existence. And this consequently means reason, since it functions conceptually, misses out existence. Now this is a standard line. It's not original with the existentialists, but they adopt it with a vengeance. They claim to be fundamental opponents of Platonism. They say we're not concerned with another world of essences, but with this world of particular concrete existing things. But they concede to the Platonists that concepts only give us knowledge of universals and are divorced from concrete individual realities. And consequently, they launch an attack on conceptualization as being detached from reality and therefore on reason. Now, if the realists on universals, on the theory of concepts, lead to that kind of emasculating of concepts, you can reach the same type of conclusion from the nominalist side. Consider the contemporary sensualist nominalist school and its effects on the theory of concepts. Concepts for the nominalists and the sensualists are, in essence, as you know, words, simply shorthand devices for strings of percepts. In other words, concepts are ultimately merely percepts. Now, given this view, and we've seen this repeatedly, these nominalists find hosts of concepts which people use, but which are meaningless, invalid by their account of the nature and meaning of concepts. You remember what Hume had to do with the concept of necessity or necessary connection. He couldn't see a necessity or feel one or touch one, and consequently the concept became meaningless. Now, many of the positivists, I don't think we mentioned this in the lecture, but it's true, did the same sort of thing with the concept of existence. They said, now red, there's a good concept because I can point to it. Green, I can point to it, but existing is. I never saw a sense data trot by, well, what existing look like, you see. And consequently, many of them said we have to dispense with such concepts as existence. Well, here again, the existentialists enter the picture. It's all set up for them, and they say, sure, we agree. All these crucial concepts, for instance, existence, crucial things, can't be grasped by rational concepts. We agree that if you go by reason, these things are meaningless, but there's something other than reason. We don't have to conceptualize existence, we simply plunge ourselves into it, non-rationally. So to summarize this point about from the theory of concepts, the one school, the traditional rationalists, remove concepts from reality because they can't explain how concepts can know individuals. The other school, the empiricists, progressively remove concepts from reality because they construe concepts as merely percepts, and thus they restrict the human range of meaningful concepts to an animal sense data level. In both cases, the door is open for the existentialists to say concepts have had their chance and have failed. We have found a way, a non-conceptual way to know reality. Now, these are the main factors, I think, philosophically giving rise to the development of existentialism. I mention here in a word one other factor. We've seen the emphasis of all the so-called pro-reason schools today on contingency. Remember the view that we've seen repeatedly, facts are simply brute occurrences. They happen to be so, but we can't see why they have to be so. They are simply contingent. There's no necessity. And school after school has maintained this. Well, the existentialists come in and say, we agree entirely. But what does it mean? It means, they say, that facts are unintelligible, that they're rationally incomprehensible, that they're ungraspable, that they're inexplicable. And the universe, therefore, is opaque, non-rational, absurd. Again, on this, as on all these other points, the pro-reason schools, in quotes, emasculate reason, and then the existentialists come in and say, reason is insufficient. Well, the upshot of all these factors is their conclusion that existence is absurd. It can't be conceptualized. It can't be grasped by reason. Your choice is reason, science, intellect, logic, theory on the one hand, or existence and concern for it on the other. And the existentialists, of course, choose existence as their concern. And this is one of their big selling points among people. They say, we are concerned with reality, with life on earth and human problems. Traditional philosophy, they say, the pragmatist, the positivist, the analyst, is removed from life. It's superficial, it's academic, it's irrelevant. And that's because, according to the existentialists, it's pro-reason. You see how these other schools play into the hands of the existentialists. Well, what do we do then if we're an existentialist and we abandon reason? We live, we exist, we seek the truth not by thought, not by logic, but how? Well, I'm going to read to you from the horse's mouth. This is a book which, if you're interested in existentialism, I recommend very highly because it's by an ardent existentialist, Professor William Barrett. It's a book called Irrational Man. I'll read a considerable amount from it this evening. It's distinguished by being one of the clearest summaries of existentialism present. It's proudly entitled Irrational Man, and we'll let him set the epistemological keynote at the outset. This is in a context where he eulogizes biblical man and the faith that he had. Talking about the biblical man's approach to knowledge, he says, quote, "It is not the kind of knowledge that man can have through reason alone, or perhaps not through reason at all. He has it rather through," and you get this list, "he has it rather through body and blood, bones and bowels, through trust and anger and confusion, and love and fear, through his passionate adhesion in faith to the being whom he can never intellectually know. This kind of knowledge a man has only through living, not reasoning. And perhaps in the end he cannot even say what it is he knows, yet it is knowledge all the same," unquote. Well, if you got that list, that pretty much exhausts the existentialist inventory of cognitive faculties: body, blood, bones, bowels, etc. The idea is you plunge yourself into existence and you let the truth well up from inside you, from your personal life, however it happens to pour out of you. Now, if you say, well, wouldn't that mean your views then are just subjective, on whichever question they pour out of you on? The existentialists would, of course, be the first to agree and say, well, of course, everyone's views are subjective. One of Kierkegaard's famous aphorisms is, truth is subjectivity. Truth is subjectivity. It's a matter of passionate feeling, not a matter of cold logical analysis, and this is hardly a surprising view for an avowedly irrationalist movement to take. So you have in advance the general irrationalist, subjectivist viewpoint of this school. Now, while we're still giving this general introductory account, there's one more ingredient common to most existentialists, which I should mention at the outset, and that is that most of them are strongly opposed to determinism philosophically. Most of them believe in something that they call freedom or free will. Now, as we'll see shortly, they have what can only be charitably called a bizarre concept of what constitutes free will. What it amounts to is they're opposed to determinism because they regard determinism as too rational a viewpoint. But nevertheless, they are usually very opposed to determinism. And they characteristically say man is free. He is self-responsible. He must constantly choose what he'll do, what he'll become. He creates himself by his choices. He is not a product of forces outside of his control. They stress this theme repeatedly. They are not, however, happy about the fact that man has free choice. On the contrary, they regard the fact that man has free choice as terrifying. Now, why is this so? Well, because the question is, how will a man know what to choose? How will he know what to do, given the basic premises of this philosophy? He obviously cannot consult reason because reason is out. He can't make sense of this absurd, incomprehensible, unintelligible world in which he's caught. He has no source of guidance whatever to advise him on what his choices and actions should be. He's caught in an unintelligible world. He's all alone. He has to choose, and there's no way to know what to choose. His mind is impotent. He's caught in a nightmare universe, and he's got to chronically make urgent decisions, and it's all on his shoulders to decide. Now you can see that if you were in this position, you would be terrified too. Now the result of this predicament is that the existentialists characteristically experience a great number of unhappy emotions. And these are called technically the existential emotions. The existential emotions. They are man's metaphysical destiny. They are metaphysical emotions. They're inherent in the fact that human beings have choice and are confronted with an absurd universe in which to exercise it. They are therefore inescapable as the plight of all men, and they are, I may say, the constant object of the existentialist concern and writing. In their works, they constantly make reference to and discuss these, and some writers have gone so far as to say that preoccupation with these particular emotions is a defining characteristic of existentialism. Well, what are the existentialist emotions? Well, I'll give you a typical list. You'll get the idea very simply. These are man's metaphysical destiny. Anxiety, anguish, guilt, fear, dread, sickness, trembling, nausea, failure, disgust, boredom, terror, shame, self-contempt, bad conscience. That gives you enough to get started with. This constitutes the human condition, the human plight. What do we do in the face of it? Well, we'll see that shortly. All right, so much for just a general overview. Now let's look at some of these existentialists or precursors of existentialists in person and put a little flesh on these bones. Now, in no sense am I going to cover all of the key points of the four figures that I'm going to mention this evening, just enough to give you a sample of some of the central themes. And I'm going to begin with Dostoevsky with his notes from Underground and read you some passages from it. I do think you'll find it a very interesting work if you want to read it. It does stress many themes picked up by later existentialists. For instance, on the question of the status of reason, if you recall here, just as background, the 19th century voluntarists that we looked at several weeks ago. Remember those people who proclaimed that there was something much more basic, important, fundamental in man than reason, and that fundamental thing was will, which was roughly a synonym for demoniacal passion, impulse, whim, feeling. And you remember that they exalted will over reason. Reason, they said, is just a tiny part of man, just a superficial part of man. And one of their characteristic ways of putting this was, I want to express my whole self, the whole man, so to speak, and not just this tiny intellectual, superficial, rational fragment. Well, this voluntarist derogation of reason is one main source of contemporary existentialism, and it's all over Dostoevsky's notes from Underground. Here is a typical passage from him on this. This is always the underground man speaking when I quote from this work. He's a fictional character, but he expresses these views very eloquently. Quote, "You see, gentlemen, reason is an excellent thing. There's no disputing that, but reason is nothing but reason, and satisfies only the rational side of man's nature, while will is a manifestation of the whole life, that is, of the whole human life, including reason and all the impulses. And although our life in this manifestation of it is often worthless, yet it is life and not simply extracting square roots. Here I, for instance, quite naturally want to live in order to satisfy all my capacities for life, and not simply my capacity for reasoning, that is, not simply 1/20th of my capacity for life. What does reason know? Reason only knows what it has succeeded in learning. Some things perhaps it will never learn. This is a poor comfort, but why not say so frankly? And human nature acts as a whole with everything that is in it consciously or unconsciously, and even if it goes wrong, it lives, unquote. There's a juicy voluntarist statement. Now, if you are a voluntarist like Dostoevsky in this particular work, what will be your concept of what free will consists of? What will it mean to have free will? Well, since you oppose will and reason, you will obviously oppose will and rationality. You will say that the exercise of free will must not be restrained by reason, that to exercise free will is to defy any and all rational laws, any and all rational knowledge. You will say, in a word, that free will is unhampered whim worship. You'll say that the enemy of free will is anything which stands in the way of what you want, and that means reason or science or the laws of mathematics, that true freedom consists of being irrational. In other words, you will see rationality as the antithesis of freedom and as the denial of freedom. And if with the tradition we take 2 and 2 make 4 as the symbol, of an absolute rational mathematical law, you will say the enemy of free will is 2 and 2 makes 4. Now, this is a very common theme in existentialists. The truly free man defies rationality, reality, and mathematics. That's what the exercise of his freedom consists of. And here is an example, quote from Dostoevsky on this, very eloquent. The underground man has just done something irrational. People tell him, well, you can't oppose reality, you can't oppose reason, facts are what they are. And here's what the underground man says. Quote, first he projects what the man of reason will say to him. Quote, upon my word, they will shout at you. It's no use protesting. It's a case of twice 2 makes 4. Nature doesn't ask your permission. She has nothing to do with your wishes. And whether you like her laws or dislike them, you are bound to accept her as she is, and consequently all her conclusions. A wall you see is a wall, and so on and so on. In other words, that's what Dostoevsky projects the rational man's view would be, and it's a very nice statement of what a rational man's view would be. Now, the underground man, the existentialist par excellence, here's this statement. A wall is a wall, facts are facts, and he says, quote, this is his answer, merciful heavens, but what do I care for the laws of nature and arithmetic, when for some reason I dislike those laws? And the fact that twice 2 makes 4. See? Now that's the whole thing, if you get that point. He goes on, of course I cannot break through the wall by battering my head against it if I really have not the strength to knock it down, the wall here being reality, you see. But I am not going to be reconciled to it simply because it's a stone wall and I haven't the strength, unquote. In other words, he's going to consistently defy reality, whether he can do it successfully or not. And here's one more brief excerpt from the underground man. Quote, mathematical certainty is, after all, something insufferable. Twice 2 makes 4 seems to me simply a piece of insolence. Twice 2, now get the imagery of this, because Dostoevsky was a real writer, so he captures the view very eloquently. Twice 2 makes 4 is a pert coxcomb who stands with arms akimbo, barring your path and spitting. See? I admit that twice 2 makes 4 is an excellent thing. But if we are to give everything its due, twice 2 makes 5 is sometimes a very charming thing too. Unquote. Now, suppose you were to say to this underground man, it would obviously be not much point talking to him, but suppose you were to say, look, in advocating the absolutism of reality and of mathematical law, I'm in no way advocating determinism. I'm in no way touching your free will. The fact that there are laws of reality doesn't interfere with your free will at all. Suppose you said you still have the free choice whether to freely recognize and adhere to these laws or not. What would he answer? Well, Dostoevsky had that thought of that one, and he writes, or the Underground Man says, quote, a very revealing short passage, quote, "You will scream at me, that is if you condescend to do so, that no one is touching my free will, that all they are concerned with is that my will should of itself, of its own free will, coincide with my own normal interests, with the laws of nature and arithmetic." See, he's absolutely right. That's what people would scream at him if they screamed at him. But now hear his answer, because that will give you the whole story. He says, quote, "Good heavens, gentlemen, what sort of free will is left when we come to tabulation and arithmetic, when it will all be a case of twice 2 makes 4? Twice 2 makes 4 without my will, as if free will meant that." Now that last one I would copy down if I were you, because that's the absolute essence of the existentialist concept of free will. Twice 2 makes 4 without my will, as if free will meant that. In other words, free will is equated with the most rampant, defiant, subjectivist, whim-worshipping irrationalism, with the worship of caprice as an end in itself, no matter how perversely defiant of reality it is. And I can't resist reading you the very opening of this Underground Man, not because it's too profound, but because the sheer capricious perverseness of it captures the theme of this whole existentialist approach. It begins as follows. I'll read you just the first paragraph. Quote, "I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. I believe my liver is diseased. However, I know nothing at all about my disease and do not know for certain what ails me. I don't consult a doctor for it and never have, though I have a respect for medicine and doctors. Besides, I am extremely superstitious, sufficiently so to respect medicine anyway. I am well educated enough not to be superstitious, but I am superstitious. No, I refuse to consult a doctor from spite. That you probably will not understand. Well, I understand it, though. Of course, I can't explain who it is precisely that I am mortifying in this case by my spite. I know better than anyone that by all this I am only injuring myself and no one else. But still, if I don't consult a doctor, it is from spite. My liver is bad, well, let it get worse." Now, you can guess from this what would be Dostoevsky, and again he speaks for the whole view, whole existentialist approach here, what would be his attitude toward the attempt to found a rational society. In the Enlightenment in the 18th century, many philosophers had the view that reason should take over, control, order, plan out human life and society. In the 19th century, many of them held the view that man, under the influence of evolution, would progressively become more rational, science would progress, and we'd form an ideal rational society. Well, for any of the volunteers, for Dostoevsky, for the existentialists, this whole ideal is completely anathema. Man is a demoniacal, perverse creature, bent on satisfying whims, and if he lived in a rational society, he would go berserk. And here is Dostoevsky's account of what would happen if we had a rational society. He tries to project we had a completely rational society. Quote, this is again the Underground Man, "Of course, there is no guaranteeing that it will not be, for instance, frightfully dull then. For what will one have to do when everything will be calculated and tabulated? But on the other hand, everything will be extraordinarily rational. Of course, boredom may lead you to anything. It is boredom sets one sticking pins into people, but all that would not matter. What is bad is that I dare say people will be thankful for the pins then. Man is stupid, you know, phenomenally stupid. Or rather, he is not at all stupid, but he is so ungrateful that you could not find another like him in all creation. I, for instance, would not be in the least surprised if all of a sudden, apropos of nothing, in the midst of general prosperity, a gentleman were to arise and, putting his arms akimbo, say to us all, 'I say, gentlemen, hadn't we better kick over the whole show and scatter rationalism to the winds simply to send these logarithms to the devil and to enable us to live once more at our own sweet, foolish will. And he would be sure to find followers, such is the nature of man. And all that for the most foolish reason, which one would think what was hardly worth mentioning, that is that man everywhere and at all times, whoever he may be, has preferred to act as he chose and not in the least as his reason and advantage dictated. One's own free, unfettered choice, one's own caprice, however wild it may be, one's own fancy worked up at times to frenzy, unquote. He goes on to say that is the greatest thing in a rational society would be its destruction. Well, that is all, I think, very clear, and you get the picture. The assault on reason, the exaltation of will, caprice, whim over reality. This is an essential strand of all later existentialism. Let's leave Dostoevsky now and look briefly at Kierkegaard. Now, as I said, he was a Danish 19th century philosopher. He's often called the father of existentialism. He was virtually unknown until the last several decades, when the existentialists, in the quest for philosophic ancestors, unearthed him and made a great deal out of him. The titles of many of his works themselves would give you the indication of what school he belongs to. For instance, he wrote one called Fear and Trembling, another called The Sickness Unto Death, another called The Concept of Dread. You get the idea. Now, Kierkegaard was an ardent, passionate Christian of the Protestant variety. Now you say, how does that make him an existentialist? Because there's been all sorts of ardent Christians who weren't existential. And that, of course, is true. But the reason is that many Christian philosophers in the past, for instance, Thomas Aquinas or even Hegel, thought that you could prove the basic tenets of religion in reason. You could make a rational philosophic system out of religion, they thought. And this indeed was one of the main attempts of religious philosophers in history. The history of philosophy is filled with attempted rational proofs of the existence of God, the soul, immortality, and so on. Now, Kierkegaard proposes to sweep all of this aside, to just throw it out completely, this whole attempt to make religion rational. His philosophic inspiration is a 2nd century father of the Catholic Church named Tertullian. Tertullian is famous for being one of the most anti-reason fathers of the Church. He was, of course, a passionate Catholic, and he uttered his famous manifesto against reason. He was asked what he thought of a certain cherished Christian dogma, which he ardently believed, but which was very difficult, not to say impossible, to defend in reason, and he answered, I believe it because it is absurd. It is certain because it is impossible. The idea being in reason, it is absurd and impossible, and therefore it must be true. And his famous line in Latin was, credo quia absurdum. I believe it because it is absurd. Well, Kierkegaard embraces Tertullian here with a passion. He resurrects the credo quia absurdum. He holds that religion is a matter of faith, not of reason. And of course, he's quite correct on this point. He argues very eloquently in passages that insofar as you attempt to give proofs for the existence of God, insofar as you try to defend religion by means of argument, you are turning religion into a science. You are destroying it as a religion. If you want to prove God, to take just one point, well, you can't give a rational proof of something if you haven't defined it. And once you define it, you limit it. You make it a thing with these attributes rather than some other attributes. And then God becomes just one object among many others. He loses his supernatural significance, and he becomes, in effect, like the law of gravity. He loses his mystical, religious significance. In other words, if we try to approach religion by means of reason, we are destroying faith and turning religion into science. What says Kierkegaard, is the point of religion, in effect, if it's going to make sense. And I think he's got a very valid point, and it's a perceptive point. If we want religion, we want room for will, for passion, for irrationality, for faith. And what will that be then? Well, says Kierkegaard, faith is belief in the absurd. And that's his word, absurd. You believe in the absurd because it's absurd. And he insists that his particular religious beliefs, the ones that he is passionately committed to, are absurd. That is their merit. That is the proof that he is a truly religious man. And of course, he's quite right. He was a very religious man for this very reason. Now, I'll quote you from Kierkegaard on this point. First, he's going to give an example of an absurdity which he believes. Quote, this is from a work called Concluding Unscientific Postscript. Quote, what now is the absurd? The absurd is that the eternal truth has come into being in time, that God has come into being, has been born, has grown up, and so forth, has come into being precisely like any other individual human being, quite indistinguishable from other individuals, unquote. In other words, he's referring here to the dogma of the incarnation, God becoming man. He goes on, quote, the absurd is precisely by its objective repulsion the measure of the intensity of faith in inwardness. Suppose a man who wishes to acquire faith. Let the comedy begin. Comedy, because you'll see this man is going to try to make it rational. He wishes to have faith, but he wishes also to safeguard himself by means of an objective inquiry and its approximation process. By approximation process, he means roughly a rational process where you weigh facts and evidence. Continue with Kierkegaard. What happened? With the help of the approximation process, the absurd becomes something different. It becomes probable. It becomes increasingly probable. It becomes extremely and emphatically probable. Now he is ready to believe it, and he ventures to claim for himself that he does not believe as shoemakers and tailors and simple folk believe, but only after long deliberation. Now he is ready to believe it, and lo, now it has become precisely impossible to believe it. Believe, you see, in the sense of having faith. Continue with Kierkegaard. Anything that is almost probable, or extremely and emphatically probable, is something he can almost know, or as good as know, or extremely and emphatically almost know, but it is impossible to believe. In other words, it's impossible to have faith once you have evidence. For the absurd is the object of faith and the only object that can be believed, unquote. So in other words, if you are to be truly religious, you must abandon all pretense at rationality and embrace the absurd because it's absurd. That's the true meaning of having faith. A point, as I say, which I think is very well taken. Something, however, stands in the way of faith, of your belief in the absurd and in the unintelligible. And what's that? Your mind, your intelligence. And so we have a predicament for Kierkegaard. Part of us, our intelligence, our intellect, is repelled by our absurd beliefs. Consequently, we have a mission in life to fight down the enemy, namely the mind, the intellect, the faculty which is repelled by the absurd. I quote from Kierkegaard, quote, it was intelligence and nothing else that had to be opposed. And he goes on modestly, quote, presumably that is why I, who had the job, was armed with an immense intelligence, unquote. I may say that if the enemy was intelligence, he won the battle. So the enemy is intelligence. As far as reason is concerned, I'll give you simply two Kierkegaardian epigrams, which will give you his viewpoint on that. Quote, what our age lacks is not reflection but passion. And, quote, the conclusions of passion are the only reliable ones, unquote. This same worship of absurdity, I may note parenthetically, applies as much to ethics as it does to any other branch of human knowledge. There's no such thing as a rational code of ethics for Kierkegaard. And here his symbol of the ideal man is Abraham from the Bible. You recall the story that Abraham was asked by God to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac, and he agreed to do so. It was absurd, God's demand. I'm here speaking for Kierkegaard, but of course he's right, it was absurd. It went counter to every human rational precept and principle, but you see, Abraham was willing to suspend reason in order to obey God. He was willing to put his faith in this ethical absurdity that you should sacrifice your beloved son for no reason. And you see from this little taste that Kierkegaard came out for a return to real Dark Age type Christianity. His main objection, or one of them to the people around him, was that they were too comfortable. They were enjoying their life on earth. And he resolved, quote, to make difficulties everywhere, unquote. He wants to recall people, you see, to the type of Christianity that would wreak havoc with their comfortable, business-oriented daily lives. Now, one other theme from Kierkegaard before we leave him. Namely, that he does, of course, believe that man has choice, but he believes that choice is a dreadful thing. We have it, but it's a dreadful, dreaded thing. Why? Well, because he says we are all confronted at every moment by innumerable possibilities. There's all sorts of different things we could do, and there is no way to know what to choose. There's no such thing as a rational ethics. There's no such thing as a rational set of principles to tell us what to do. Yet we have to choose, and here's the point, each choice we make is decisive. It cuts off, it slashes away a whole set of possibilities. Every time you commit yourself to something, you wipe out a whole range of alternatives, which you can't have by virtue of the fact that you took the thing you did. If you commit yourself to one career, then you wipe out the chance of all the rest. If you commit yourself to one woman, then think of all the others you're passing up. If you commit yourself to one philosophy, then you can't be an advocate of all the others, and etc. Every choice decisively slashes off a whole range of possibilities which are irrevocably gone. And this, of course, if you don't have any idea what you're doing, is a very frightening state of affairs. You are committing yourself irrevocably. You're wiping out all sorts of possible alternatives, and God only knows what you're missing in the process. And I mean that last statement literally. God only knows. Consequently, for Kierkegaard, choice is terrifying. We are, as he puts it, dizzy in our freedom. The either-or, another one of his works, the either-or slashes through our lives, and whatever choice we make, we do so in, another of his phrases, fear and trembling. I interject here briefly that, of course, our obstacle is the law of identity. Here, A is A. You can't have your cake and eat it too. If you have it, you can't eat it, and vice versa. One slashes off the other. It's either or. But the existentialists will not be content to accept the law of identity. You remember the underground man, he's going to smash his head through that wall as well as he can, and the existentialists persist in this viewpoint. And since Kierkegaard, this has been a very common plaint of existentialists, the dreadfulness of choice. In any event, we must, he says, do something. We can't just sit there agonizing forever between various alternatives. We have to commit ourselves. We have to grab a hold of one of these possibilities, latch onto it, commit ourselves. Our commitment, of course, will be thoroughly irrational, because there's no such thing as a rational commitment. There's no use trying to say, I've got logic on my side. Here's my reasons for making this choice or commitment rather than this. You haven't got logic on your side. Nobody has logic on his side in anything that he does. You have no ground to stand on, nothing to base your choice on. You just make a leap into the absurd, and that's called an existential commitment. You just latch on to something and say, that's it. If, of course, you think that you've got a good argument for your viewpoint, you're simply engaging in self-deception. You're trying to escape your plight and pretend that you've got reasons for what you're doing. Well, what is life like for Kierkegaard? Life for man now on this view. Well, we are all in despair. We are afraid to face ourselves all the way down, because if we did, we would see how rotten, how weak, how sordid we are. We suffer the sickness unto death, the sickness unto death being despair, but of course we will, says Kierkegaard, one day die, and in his version return to God. Well, so much for a few themes from Kierkegaard. Let's take our break here, and then we'll come back and look at some 20th century existentialists. All right, now let us look at Martin Heidegger, who was born in 1889 and is still alive. A German philosopher. He writes in German with everything that implies. He is not what you would call a religious existentialist, nor is he exactly an atheistic existentialist. It's commonly said that God is not the object of his concern, so let's leave it like that. Now, he more than anyone made existentialism academically respectable in this century. He is a professor, and he writes using an incredible apparatus of scholastic technical terms. His writings are extraordinarily obscure, virtually unintelligible, and the effect of that on many people is, of course, that there must be something profound here. Nietzsche had a line about the poets in which he said they muddy their waters to make them appear deep, and this is certainly true in the case of Heidegger. To support this statement, I'm going to read you a brief passage from one of his works. I tell you in advance that no context is necessary, nor would it help you. I will pause at the periods. Quote, "What does existence mean in being and time?" That was one of his works. "The word designates a mode of being, specifically the being of those beings who stand open for the openness of being in which they stand by standing it. This standing it, this enduring, is experienced under the name of care. The ecstatic essence of being there is approached by way of care, and conversely, care is experienced adequately only in its ecstatic essence." I'll give you just one more sentence to get the flavor. "The proposition man exists means man is that being whose being is distinguished by the open standing in the unconcealedness of being from being in being." Now, you see that when you hear that, you would have a temptation to become an advocate of the verifiability theory of meaning. And of course, the positivists and pragmatists love to quote a Heidegger, because his statements, many of them, are actually meaningless. But the moral that they draw, he's their favorite whipping boy. And the moral they draw is this is what happens when you try to engage in metaphysics and leave the realm of sense data. You see, so they feed on each other. Now a few themes from Heidegger. He too holds existence to be absurd. And his particular contribution on this question is to look at existence and to ask what has become a famous question. Namely, quote, "Why is there any being at all and not rather nothing?" Unquote. Why is there any being at all and not rather nothing? And this, he states, is the most basic, the most profound, the most original question of all metaphysics. The assumption, of course, I add here of the question, the assumption underlying it is that being or existence is not a primary. It shouldn't exist. So left to its own devices, if things behave normally, we'd expect there would just be a spread of nothing. However, there is something, and that is a baffling mystery. Why is there something? Consequently, existence is absurd. We are baffled as to why it's here at all. I may say Heidegger says that though this question is unanswerable, he is still working on it. Well, now, there is in any event something which is. There is being. Now, at this point, I must introduce you to a distinction made by Heidegger between two senses of the term being. Being, in English now, with a small b used as a noun, and being with a capital B. How will I make this distinction? Well, for instance, I point to that picture, and I say that is a being, a thing which is, an object, a picture, a table, a cup, a pack of matches, etc. Those are all examples of individual beings with a small b. But common to all such beings is the fact that they have being, with a capital B now. You see, we can speak of the being of these beings. And that first being, the being of these beings, is the fact that they exist, as I sometimes put the to be of these beings. Now, I interject here that, of course, the only distinction you could make, if you were to make this distinction, is between an abstraction and its concretes. The individual beings are the concretes, and being with a capital B, if it means anything in Heidegger's context, could only be the concept that names what they all have in common, namely that they are. But this is certainly not how Heidegger interprets this distinction. For Heidegger, being with a capital B is unconceptualizable. It's like existence. It's outside of the province of reason, and he in effect erects two different dimensions out of this distinction. There is the world of things, of objects which are of beings, and then there is in effect a mystical dimension of being with a capital B, which is his version of true reality and about which he talks all the time. Of course, he doesn't characterize what this dimension of being with a capital B is, because it can't be formulated in concepts. If you want to attach any meaning to it, the closest you can get is to think of it as, in effect, Heidegger's version of God. What God is to a religious philosophy, being with a capital B is to Heidegger's philosophy. It's like a mystic dimension which transcends this world and which is its source. Now, if you ask what is being, well, I'll give you Professor Barrett's being with a capital B now, this superior dimension. I'll give you Professor Barrett's answer. He's just been expounding on Heidegger, and he says, quote, "But what is being?" With a capital B now. I imagine the reader asking in perplexity, now that I have given at least the outlines of Heidegger's thought. We still haven't been told about that. And then Professor Barrett goes on, "We like the compact formulae that tell us clearly what a thing is. A triangle is a plane figure bounded by three straight lines. Well, then we know what a triangle is. We want a concept to go by. And a concept is a representation or picture of the thing. But being, unlike a triangle, is something of which we can have no mental picture or representation. We reach it by a kind of thought other than conceptual reason. We must think of being by letting it be present to us even though we can have no mental picture of it. Being is indeed just this presence, invisible and all-pervasive, which cannot be enclosed in any mental concept. To think it is to thank it. To remember it with gratitude, for our human existence is ultimately rooted in it." But Heidegger has not told us in so many words what being is, unquote. And that is, putting it mildly, that he hasn't told us in so many words. It's ineffable. Well, we have two dimensions then. And we are all caught in this one, this world of things, of objects, of beings. We are all preoccupied with this world of objects and beings. What should we do? Well, according to Heidegger, We have to return to an awareness of true reality, the realm of being with a capital B, from which we are estranged or alienated. You'll find that clearer if you simply substitute God. The traditional view was, of course, we should renounce this world. The traditional religious view was we should renounce this world and devote ourselves to God. In Heidegger's view, it amounts to the same thing, only he talks about being instead of about God. We must, he says, abandon our preoccupation with things and make ourselves, quote, open to being. And of course, this means abandoning reason, because reason gives us only beings with a small b. We'll still think, he said, but we will not any longer use reason to guide our thought. Now, here's a quote from Heidegger. Quote, thinking only begins at the point where we have come to know that reason, glorified for centuries, is the most obstinate adversary of thinking. Unquote. Reason is the most obstinate adversary of thinking. Now, if you find that unclear, Heidegger's disciples would normally come back to you and say, Heidegger is trying to do with words what modern non-objectivist artists do with paint. He doesn't believe that words should be representational. He wants to do in philosophy what the non-objective artists are doing in painting. And here's a quote from Professor Kaufman on this, quote, Heidegger belongs to the contemporary revolt against representation. Even as modern prose and painting are no longer satisfied with the representation of events or things, Heidegger feels that the time has come for philosophy to break with what he calls representational thinking. His partisans occasionally counter criticisms, saying that they presuppose the competence of common sense or logic, and their voices show the scorn with which a critic of Picasso might be told that he is a mere Philistine. Unquote. Well, that, you see, is all perfectly clear, straightforward irrationalism. How do we come to know being with a capital B? Well, we know for certain that you don't do it by intellectual means. And here Professor Barrett points out that we can learn something from the Orientals, who long ago discovered the limitations of the intellect. Quote, in neither India nor China, nor in the philosophies that these civilizations produced, was truth located in the intellect. On the contrary, the Indian and Chinese sages insisted on the very opposite, namely that man does not attain to truth so long as he remains locked up in his intellect. A man who located his truth in the mind would have struck these sages not merely as mistaken, but as a human psychological aberration. The great historical parting of the ways between Western and Eastern man came about because each made a different decision as to what truth is, unquote. And here, of course, Heidegger is on the Oriental axis. But he isn't confined to just that. There's a wide variety of different things you can do to open yourself up to being. You attune yourself to it. You expose yourself to it. You utilize your feelings. You open your bones. You name it. He even says at one point that boredom is a cognitive instrument of definite efficacy and value. I mean, boredom. The idea behind this point being that when you're bored, completely bored, you see, you're indifferent to this object and that object. You're not attached to or interested in any particular thing, and therefore you're ready to be open to being in general. And consequently, Heidegger at one point exalts the cognitive efficacy of boredom. As one commentator puts it, quote, boredom indeed reveals to us what is, unquote. And Heidegger here characterizes the type of boredom he has in mind, just to show you that he actually says these things, as the following quote, a deep boredom, this is from Heidegger now, a deep boredom drifting hither and thither through the abysses of existence like a deep joy, unquote. Now, of course, if it were true that being bored gave you precious knowledge, then I would say that by that standard, reading Heidegger would make anybody omniscient. Well, now, what about Heidegger's view of man? Well, he doesn't like the word man nor its German equivalent because it carries too many associations. If I say somebody is a man, for instance, I immediately suggest to you, well, he has a body, he has a consciousness, and that, of course, brings up the whole subject-object distinction, which Heidegger very much opposes, along with many of the other contemporary schools, as we've seen. So he wants a neutral term for man, one which has no philosophic associations and which will commit you in advance to nothing. Well, what term does he come up with? Well, man has being. He exists here, there. What better thing to call him then than the being which is there? And in German, being is sein, S-E-I-N, and there is da, D-A, and consequently Heidegger refers to man as Dasein, Dasein, the being there, the thing which is there. So given this name, we can say that man for Heidegger is a hunk of being which is there. Now perhaps the word hunk is unsympathetic. Let's say instead a smear of being, or if not that, a field of being, because that's the term Professor Barrett uses. And I'll quote you again from Professor Barrett on Heidegger's view of man as Dasein. Quote, existence itself, according to Heidegger, means to stand outside oneself, to be beyond oneself. My being is not something that takes place inside my skin. My being rather is spread over a field or a region, which is the world of its care and concern. Heidegger's theory of man and of being might be called the field theory of man, or the field theory of being, in analogy with Einstein's field theory of matter, provided we take this purely as an analogy. Heidegger takes man to be a field or region of being. Think of a magnetic field without the solid body of the magnet at its center. Man's being is such a field, but there is no soul substance or ego substance at the center from which that field radiates. Heidegger calls this field of being Dasein. Dasein is his name for man. One of the most remarkable things about Heidegger's description of human existence is that it is made without his using the term man at all. He thereby avoids the assumption that we are dealing with a definite object with a fixed nature. Unquote. Well, we have then this field of being, Dasein, man. Is Dasein happy? No. The fundamental metaphysical mood of Dasein is angst, which is German for anxiety or anguish. Why? Well, among many reasons, one central one is there is a disaster in store for Dasein, a metaphysical disaster that is unavoidable, that makes Dasein wretched. What is the disaster? Death. Now this is a common existentialist theme and plaint. Now you may ask, why make a metaphysical catastrophe out of the fact that we're going to die one day? You may say all men are mortal, and that is a fact of reality, and I accept it and act accordingly. In fact, if you know Epicurus in the ancient world, he took care of this whole problem of death very well, very succinctly, with the following argument. He said, death should be nobody's concern at all, because no one will ever encounter it. He said, death is not a problem of the living because they're alive, and it's not a problem of the dead because they're not. And consequently, he said, no one will ever know any state other than life, and there's no point groveling before the fact of death. Now, the existentialists, I may say, reject this viewpoint entirely. I have not been able to discover any arguments put forth, even bad ones, in favor of the view that death represents a metaphysical trauma. And I believe that the position that they take is explicable, not philosophically, but only psychopathologically. However, it is a common theme of them to say that all men are characterized at root, metaphysically, by a passionate terror of death. And here again, I let Professor Barrett speak. Quote, the authentic meaning of death, I am to die, is not as an external and public fact within the world, but as an internal possibility of my own being. Nor is it a possibility like a point at the end of a road which I will in time reach. So long as I think in this way, I still hold death at a distance outside myself. The point is that I may die at any moment, and therefore death is my possibility now. It is like a precipice at my feet. It is also the most extreme and absolute of my possibilities. Extreme because it is the possibility of not being, and hence cuts off all other possibilities. Absolute because man can surmount all other heartbreaks, even the deaths of those he loves, but his own death puts an end to him. Hence death, get the logic of this, hence death is the most personal and intimate of possibilities, since it is what I must suffer for myself. Nobody else can die for me. Only by taking my death into myself, according to Heidegger, does an authentic existence become possible to me. Touched by this interior angel of death, I cease to be the impersonal and social one among many, and I am free to become myself. Though terrifying, the taking of death into ourselves is also liberating. It frees us from servitude to the petty cares that threaten to engulf our daily life, and thereby opens us to the essential projects by which we make our lives personally and significantly our own. Heidegger calls this the condition of, quote, freedom toward death, or resoluteness, unquote. Now, what conclusions, continuing the presentation of Heidegger, can we draw from the fact of death? Now, you might be tempted to say that the existentialist should draw the conclusion that their morbid, obsessive terror of death indicates that they are living incorrectly, and that their rampant irrationalism has made them lose contact with and any sense of control over reality, and that as a result of that, they will experience only terror, anxiety, and fear of destruction. But of course, if you took that interpretation, that would mean they were to blame, not life and the universe. The existentialists, of course, do not take that interpretation. They say the fact of death and anxiety reveals something profound about the universe, something metaphysical. It reveals a dark power at work in the universe, a power which wreaks havoc with existence itself and, of course, with human beings. A power, a fact which dominates our lives, penetrates to the core of our being, and is the source of our troubles. Well, of course, the question is, what is this power, this force, this positive entity which is so metaphysically potent? The answer in a word is nothing. Or if you prefer, nothingness, which is a very common term in existentialism, or if you prefer the German das Nichts, which just means the nothing, nothingness. Now, to explain this point to you, I have to remind you first of the common sense, and in this case also the objectivist view. Namely, that there is a basic distinction between something and nothing, and that all that exists are somethings. There is no nothing. This is not an existentialist view now. There are only some things. If I say I have nothing in my pocket, I think it's clear that I don't mean I have a pocket full of a special kind of stuff known as nothing. I obviously simply mean I don't have any money or any objects or whatever in my pocket. In other words, negatives are not positives. And negatives have meaning only in relation to positives and signify the absence of some specific positive. No money, no food, or whatever it happens to be. But the common sense and the objectivist view is there is no such entity, a sheer nothingness floating around, showing up in negative statements. But now this is the diametric opposite of the Heideggerian view. For him, and for many of the existentialists who follow in his wake, nothingness is everywhere, as a positive entity, as a constituent of the universe, as a kind of gigantic blob of zero which permeates everything. As one commentator puts it, speaking of Sartre, quote, he, quote, noses out all the sordid and seedy strands of nothingness that haunt our human condition like a bad breath or body odor, unquote. Or says Sartre himself, quote, nothingness is prior to being, unquote. See, it's an essential positive element in the makeup of the cosmos. Says Sartre again, quote, nothingness lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm, unquote. Samuel Beckett says, quote, nothing is more real than nothing, unquote. And you can multiply this endlessly, this insistence upon the all-pervasive presence of nothingness. Now, where do they all find nothingness? I won't put that comment on the tape. Well, the answer is that any time you can utter a negative proposition, which is of some importance to man, any proposition where the not is significant, they say, you see, there's the manifestation of nothingness. There is das Nichts popping up. For instance, they take the issue of death. To say I will die is to say I will not live forever. And the not is the vital thing there. That's the nothing, das Nichts. Now, you might be tempted to say, well, when you die, you simply aren't anymore. But they would say, oh, no. When you die, you are engulfed in nothingness, in das Nichts. Or take the experience of dread or anxiety, because that for them also reveals nothingness. Now here we mean pathological anxiety in contrast to normal fear. In the case of pathological anxiety experienced by many neurotics, it's common for them to say, if you ask them, well, what are you terrified of? I'm not afraid of anything in particular. I'm not afraid of this thing or that thing. There's nothing in particular that I can name that I'm afraid of. And that is a common fact about pathological anxiety. Of course, I interject, the truth is they're afraid of everything in general, of reality and their inability to deal with it. But the existentialists take the neurotic statement straight. He says he's afraid of nothing in particular. And you see, that means he is afraid of nothingness. As Professor Barrett says, anxiety is, quote, the uncanny feeling of being afraid of nothing at all. It is precisely nothingness that makes itself present and felt as the object of our dread, unquote. And take another example. Why is choice so terrifying? Because whenever we choose, think of all the things you cannot have any longer. And there's another crucial not. You're surrounded by a sea of nothingness. Anytime you choose X, all the other things, all the non-X's, sink into the oblivion of nothingness. There is a quote on this one, again from Professor Barrett, but to show you the extent to which they subscribe to this view, quote, in choosing I have to say no somewhere. And this no, which is total and totally exclusive of other alternatives, is dreadful. but only by shutting myself up in it is any resoluteness of action possible. A friend of mine, a very intelligent and sensitive man, was over a long period in the grip of a neurosis, which took the form of indecision in the face of almost every occasion of life. Sitting in a restaurant, he could not look at the printed menu to choose his lunch without seeing the abyss of the negative open before his eyes on the page, and so falling into a sweat. He was not a Sartrean and had not even read Sartre, but his description of his own experience was exactly in terms of this abyss of nothing opening before his eyes on the page, unquote. Now you see, you can do this endlessly. Man is finite. What does it mean? Well, man is only so much, and he's not anymore. He is A, B, and C plus nothingness. Says Professor Barrett, human finitude is the presence of the not in the being of man. Now you see, you would characteristically say, when I say man is finite, all I mean is he's got characteristics A, B, and C, and that's all. But the existentialists say, oh no, when you say man is finite, you're saying he's got characteristics A, B, and C, and the further characteristic of nothingness. That's like an extra added ingredient on top of the A, B, and C, which is what makes him finite. Now, there's a whole trend to change the negative into a positive, to make a special entity out of nothing. To confer existence on non-existence reaches its culmination and climax in Heidegger, in a famous phrase which he originated. He wants to stress the positive nature and the metaphysical function of nothingness. And so he coined a term, Nichten, which had not existed previously, a German term, which is a verb out of the word for nothing. And it means to nothing. And he delivered himself of the famous utterance, das Nichts, nichtet, which translates literally into nothing, nothings. Nothing, nothings. See, nothing is a positive entity, and it's there in the world, and what can a nothing do but nothing? See, it injects negativity wherever it goes. And that thought he expresses in this fundamental proposition, das Nichts, nichtet. I had a student on an exam once who translated that as nothing does its own thing. Now, I can quote from another commentator here from a book that tries to explain das Nichts, nichtet. Quote, Heidegger conceives of nothingness as more than just a mere negation. On the contrary, nothingness, and this is central for all of Heidegger's thought, is deeply ingrained in being itself. It is that which opens being up and lets it appear in Dasein. Heidegger, in order to characterize nothingness and its important working, formulated his famous das Nichts, nichtet, a phrase widely ridiculed and defying translation. The phrase can be explained, however, as stating that nothingness permeates all beings, a fact which appears when it lets them eventually disintegrate as beings. But Nichten also indicates that being itself came into its own only by virtue of nothingness. As a dynamic force in being, nothingness gives birth to being, unquote. Now, if you want to grasp the role of das Nichts, nichtet in Heidegger, it occupies in his philosophy approximately the corresponding place that the proposition existence exists occupies in objectivism. You see it as the exact antithesis. Existence exists, das Nichts, nichtet, nothing, nothings. In fact, if you wanted me to summarize existentialism, following the pattern of Galt's statement on existence exists, but substituting the appropriate existentialist content. You remember the passage in Galt's speech where he says existence exists, and the act of grasping that implies two corollary axioms, that something exists which one perceives and that one exists possessing consciousness. Well, if I were to rewrite for a moment that passage using the Heideggerian existentialist approach, you'd come up with something like this. Nothing nothings, and the act of not understanding that state implies two corollary axioms. That nothing exists, that nothingness exists, which one doesn't perceive, and that one exists possessing non-consciousness, this being the faculty of not perceiving that which doesn't exist. That gives you an idea of how you would organize existentialism metaphysically. Now you may ask, does Heidegger believe that his views on being and nothingness are rational or logical? And I quote from Heidegger, quote, "It does not go without saying, after all, that logic and its basic rules can furnish our standards when we ask about what has being as such. It could be the other way around, and the whole of our familiar logic, which is usually treated like a gift from heaven, might be based on one very particular answer to the question about what has being. In that case, any thinking that follows solely the laws of thought of our received logic would be quite unable from the outset even to understand the question about what has being, not to speak of really developing it and leading it toward an answer," unquote. In other words, logic is incapable of grasping being, and this is true in spades for nothingness. Quote from Heidegger, "The nothing remains inaccessible on principle to any scientific approach. Whoever wants to speak in truth of the nothing must necessarily become unscientific. But this remains a great misfortune only as long as one supposes that scientific thinking is the only really rigorous way of thinking," unquote. And one more brief one from Heidegger on this, quote, "Genuine utterances about the nothing must always remain unusual. It cannot be made common. It dissolves when it is placed in the cheap acid of mere logical acumen," unquote. Well, on this note of nothing, let us turn for a few words to Sartre, one of whose main works is, of course, Being and Nothingness, so you see the Heideggerian influence. He was born in 1905. French, as I mentioned, the main popularizer of existentialism in the period during and after World War II. He is an avowed atheist. There is no God, according to him, and he's very definite about that. He has, just like Heidegger, who very much influenced him, a muddy, obscure, opaque metaphysics filled with jargon and paradox and contradiction, but I'm going to pass all of that over. I'm going to look instead briefly at his theory of free will and its consequences. And I do this because sometimes people hear that Sartre advocates free will, and they know objectivism advocates free will, and they believe this is a point of contact between objectivism and existentialism, and I would like to disabuse you of that idea, and nothing will do it better than to give you Sartre's theory of free will. He does believe strongly in what he calls free will. He insists that man is absolutely free. He's not the product of God, or the environment, or the unconscious, or heredity, etc. Man alone, he says, is completely responsible for himself. Well, what kind of freedom does he have? And here you must remember the point we made in discussing Dostoevsky. Freedom for existentialists is freedom from reality. Freedom from any and all restrictions. Freedom from any and all limitations. Freedom from the fact that 2 and 2 equals 4. Freedom from the restraints of nature. Now, Sartre takes this line and develops it whole hog. He argues as follows. He says, if man had any nature at all, any nature, at birth, then he would not be free. Because if he had any nature, it would be something specific, and he would then be limited or determined by his nature, by the particular identity he has. He would no longer be unlimited, and then he would no longer be free. And of course this follows if you equate freedom with the absence of any limitation of any kind. Then of course freedom presupposes the absence of any identity on the part of the being, because insofar as he has an identity, that limits him. Now of course in a rational sense of freedom, this conclusion doesn't follow at all, because you could very well take the view, as objectivism does, that man has a definite nature, but that nature includes the fact that he has a volitional consciousness. So he has a nature, but he is still free. But in Sartre's sense, where freedom has to be freedom from any limitation, freedom from reality and identity, then of course his conclusion follows. If you are to be free, you can have no nature at all. And if you presented the objectivist view of freedom to Sartre, he would regard that as determinism. He'd say your freedom is to focus on reality or not. What kind of freedom is that? And here you have to remember Dostoevsky, 2 and 2 make 4 without my will, as if free will meant that. Consequently, for Sartre, as an advocate of freedom, man has no antecedent or initial nature or identity at all. He literally creates himself. Now there is a equivocation in Sartre's writing when he makes these claims about man creates himself. Sometimes he simply means he creates his own character. Sometimes he uses it to mean he actually creates his metaphysical identity. He makes himself the type of entity metaphysically that he is. And he switches back and forth between those two, using the first to give plausibility to the second, which is his real meaning. He expresses this view that man creates his own metaphysical identity in his famous formulation, existence precedes essence. This is meant to apply to human beings. And by essence here, we mean identity. Existence precedes essence. That's his famous line. And the line means, first man exists. At the start, he has no identity. And then, by his various acts of choice, he creates himself into something. He gives himself an identity. He becomes a something. Well, now see if you can guess, well, what is he at the start then? Before any of the acts of choice that confer an identity upon him. Well, I see that some of you guessed it. He is nothingness. He does to himself what the Christian God does to reality. He creates himself ex nihilo, out of nothing. At the start, he is nothing, and precisely because he's nothing, you see, he is free to create himself however he wants. And thus we have Sartre's view that free will and the law of identity are mutually opposed to each other. If man had a nature, which the law of identity would require, then he would be limited, he wouldn't have free choice. If he's to have free choice, he must at the outset be nothing in particular. One character in one of Sartre's novels puts it this way. Now get the logic of this statement. Quote, for a human being, to be is to choose himself. Nothing comes to him either from without or from within himself that he can receive or accept. Freedom is the being of man, that is to say, his non-being. Did you get that? Freedom is the being of man, that is to say, his non-being. In other words, freedom is essential to man, but in order to have it, you have to be nothing. Because if you were something, you wouldn't have it. And as one commentator puts it, quote, man exists, that is, as nothing. If he were anything, he would not be free, unquote. If you want that directly from Sartre himself, he puts it briefly as follows, quote, what do we mean by saying that existence precedes essence? We mean that man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. If man as the existentialist sees him as not definable, it is because to begin with he is nothing. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. Thus there is no human nature, unquote. It's sometimes said that Sartre has a bubble view or a bubble theory of the self, because a bubble, you see, has nothing at its center, and so does man, according to him. Now, I don't think I have to expound on how opposed to objectivism this particular view of free will is. Now, what is the consequences for Sartre of our possession of this type of freedom? Well, it's a dreadful thing. It is, he says, a curse, not a blessing. We are, quote, condemned, unquote, to be free. Well, why is it such a curse? Because, again, there is no way to know what to do. Existence is irrational, absurd. In the old days, you could look to God to tell you what to do, but there is no God, according to Sartre, and therefore there is no one to give us orders or tell us what's right or wrong. In the old days, you could look to human nature and try and say, this is the nature of man, therefore this is how he should live, but now there is no human nature anymore. Man at root is nothing, and consequently there's no basis for an ethics. There's nothing to turn to. There's no foundation for our actions. We're caught in a meaningless world, which is riddled with nothingness, death hovering over us, and yet we have free choice and must act, and we don't know how. But we must, and we can. Consequently, we feel forlorn, abandoned, anguish. And I'll read you again from Sartre, because he's pretty clear on this point. The existentialist, quoting now, the existentialist finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist. For there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. There can no longer be any good a priori, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. Unquote. In other words, he simply accepts the view that if you were to have value judgments, they would have to be divine commandments. There's no other source. And since we have now abandoned God, we're left in the position that there are no value judgments. So he continues, quote, "It is nowhere written that the good exists, that one must be honest or must not lie, since we are now upon the plane where there are only men. Dostoevsky once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. And that for existentialism is the starting point. Everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist, and man is in consequence forlorn, for he cannot find anything to depend upon either within or outside himself. He discovers forthwith that he is without excuse. For if indeed existence precedes essence, one will never be able to explain one's action by reference to a given and specific human nature. In other words, there's no determinism. Man is free. Man is freedom. Nor, on the other hand, if God does not exist, are we provided with any values or commands that could legitimize our behavior. Thus, we have neither behind us nor before us in a luminous realm of values any means of justification or excuse. We are left alone without excuse. That is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free. Condemned because he did not create himself, yet is nevertheless at liberty, and from the moment that he is thrown into this world, he is responsible for everything he does." Unquote. And as one other commentator summarizes in a good line, quote, "Human life on this view is cut off from natural foundation and supernatural guarantee. Value has no anchorage either in natural law or divine command. Man in his dreadful freedom and total responsibility stands completely alone." Unquote. So man is alien, without reason, without hope, the same way existence is. And given that, the question is, what difference does it make what you do? Says Sartre somewhere or other, quote, "Thus it amounts to the same thing whether one gets drunk alone or is a leader of nations." Unquote. You see, it's completely hopeless, futile, absurd. Sartre once reported that he had a conversation with an American. They were talking about the troubles of the world. The American was taking the view, if only we could school people to become rational, we could solve all our problems. And Sartre reported that it was useless to talk to him. He says, the trouble is, I believe in the existence of evil and he doesn't. I take evil seriously because, you see, for him, evil, nothingness, is now metaphysical. It's built into reality. Reality is inherently absurd and undealable with, and there's no way out. What does he feel when he looks at reality? Well, the title of one of his early works gives you the answer: nausea. Here at one point is looking at a chestnut tree, and he overflows with a sense of nausea at the phenomenon of this full, rich, living entity. How should we act? Well, we're trapped. There's no way out. Another one of his plays is titled No Exit. All we can do, he says, is be authentic. In other words, don't be an escapist. An escapist is what most people are. They try to escape from the sordid spectacle of life and reality by finding some code of philosophy or some religion or some set of rationalizations which will give them guidance. Now for Sartre, this is all a sham. There's no such thing as finding a philosophy, an ethics, a religion, a system which will tell you what to do. If you think you've got the answers, you're guilty of what Sartre calls bad faith. You're inauthentic. At other times, he refers to these people as les salauds, the bastards. That's his technical use for them. These people, you see, who hide from themselves the truth of their horrible and inescapable freedom. And what you really should do is face up to it. Face up to what the world is like and what you're like, and then throw yourself into a life of action. Make some passionate commitment, aware consciously that whatever you commit yourself to is absurd, that life is absurd, that existence is absurd, and then you live out your days knowing insecurity, dread, forlornness, etc. You suffer and suffer, and then one day you die. So much for Sartre. Now I want to say one last word on the existentialists. They put this philosophy forth very often as individualist. I would just like in a couple of sentences to indicate, I think it's already clear that whatever this philosophy is, it is not individualism. Individualism psychologically is above all the attitude of relying on the judgment of your own independent mind, which is your only source of independence. The existentialists, of course, abandon the mind on principle, and consequently they abandon the source of independence. They are subjectivist irrationalists. They are not individualists. As far as politics are concerned, I'll give you just a few facts to take care of the idea that these people are individualists. Kierkegaard preached political authoritarianism. Heidegger, in 1933, gave an address in which he publicly embraced Nazism, declared that all philosophers must hereafter think in the service of the Nazi state, and repudiated a Jewish philosopher that he had earlier studied under. This was the philosopher Husserl, because he was Jewish. And of course, as far as Sartre is concerned, he has been in intimate, open association with the Communist Party in France for years and years, and at one point wrote a book on Cuba in which he described Fidel Castro as the existentialist man of action par excellence. In other words, the existentialists politically on the whole are out-and-out collectivists, which should not surprise anyone. It's ridiculous to treat them as individualists on any level, psychological, ethical, or political. This I assume you understand. Now, I have a couple of minutes left. I want to say something briefly about a movement associated with existentialism. So I tack on at the end here because it has certain affinities to existentialism, and that is Zen Buddhism. Now I'll confine myself to a few brief remarks here, but no presentation of existentialism is complete without saying a word on Zen Buddhism. Buddhism, of course, is an Oriental religion developed in the 5th century BC in India, named after the Buddha, the enlightened one. It was brought to China in the 6th century A.D., and then several centuries later to Japan, and the Japanese form of Buddhism is called Zen Buddhism, from the word Zen meaning meditation. It has a number of essential similarities with existentialism. It's profoundly irrationalist. It worships nothingness and so on. I may say that it is not, as such, very big among professional philosophers today, but it does have a following in a certain type of intellectual circle, of which Erich Fromm would be the best example. Now, there will be no structure to my exposition of Zen Buddhism, because it is a rampant irrationalism, and you couldn't find a structure in it. You'll find formulations like reality is emptiness, nirvana, which is also full, of course. It's finite and infinite. All is one, but it isn't one. The goal is to contact reality and merge with it while not contacting reality and not merging with it, etc. Now, if you say to me, oh, but this isn't logical, I would say that Zen Buddhists are violently opposed to logic, science, concepts, intellect, language, and they are very explicit about this. If, for any reason, and I can't imagine why you would want to, but you wanted to read a book on Zen Buddhism, here is selected writings by Daisetsu Suzuki, S-U-Z-U-K-I, which is as clear as anything I've read on Zen Buddhism, which has been very little, I may say. But here's a quote or two from him on his Zen Buddhist view of logic. Quote, according to the philosophy of Zen, we are too much of a slave to the conventional way of thinking, which is dualistic through and through. No interpenetration is allowed. There takes place no fusing of opposites in our everyday logic. See, our everyday logic is A is A, it's either A or non-A. He goes on, in our everyday logic, what belongs to God is not of this world, and what is of this world is incompatible with the divine. Black is not white, and white is not black. Tiger is tiger, and cat is cat, etc. This is the way things or ideas go in this universe of the senses and syllogisms. Zen, however, upsets this scheme of thought and substitutes a new one, in which there exists no logic, no dualistic arrangement of ideas. He quotes a little later from one advocate of the movement, quote, empty-handed I go, and yet the spade is in my hands. I walk on foot, and yet on the back of an ox I am riding. When I pass over the bridge, lo, the water floweth not, but the bridge doth flow. And he comments, this sounds altogether out of reason. But in fact, Zen abounds with such graphic irrationality. Now get this one. The flower is not red, nor is the willow green, is one of the best known utterances of Zen, and is regarded as the same as its affirmative. The flower is red and the willow is green. To put it in logical formula, it will run like this. A is at once A and not A. If so, I am I, and yet you are I, unquote. And he could have added, I am not I, and you are not I, and I am not you, and I am you, and you can go on, you see, indefinitely. What about the facts of experience? Quote, Zen carries its assertions into every detail of our daily life. It has no hesitation in flatly denying all our most familiar facts of experience. I am writing here, and yet I have not written a word. You are perhaps reading this now, and yet there is not a person in the world who reads. I am utterly blind and deaf, but every color is recognized and every sound discerned. The Zen masters will go on like this indefinitely. And they do. Now, what is the Their goal, as they put it, the goal is to achieve a state which they call Satori, S-A-T-O-R-I, which means a kind of mystic blending or merging with reality in which your whole mind is entirely submerged and you become one with the ineffable. It's a kind of mystic enlightenment which you have when you completely abnegate your mind. Suzuki describes the characteristics in detail. If you want further advice, you can read his book. How do they go about inculcating this state of Satori in their disciples? Well, the master typically tries to create over a sustained period of time a nightmarishly irrational world in order to break the mind of the disciple, in order to make him lose his hold on whatever remnants of intellect and logic are left to him. The master will set meaningless questions, impossible tasks, give them questions to which there's no possible answer, or when the disciple asks the master a question, he'd be answered by some grotesque irrelevancy that the disciple cannot possibly comprehend the point of. The disciple will say something like, "What is the Buddha?" And the master will look at him and say, "I've been to town today." And you're supposed to then go back and meditate for X number of years until you get the point. Or sometimes they have all these techniques worked out. The disciple will ask a question and the master will merely mimic the question. Or he'll answer in deliberate contradictions. Or he'll smash the disciple on the head. Masters have been known to sever a disciple's finger, or to hack a kitten in two before a group of assembled monks as an answer to a question. The idea is, you see, to provide the disciple with a completely irrational, unintelligible environment until he loses his last grasp on rationality, and then he has Satori. Now, what is distinctive about Zen Buddhism? Well, the only thing you can say is that it is more nakedly and overtly irrational than Western mysticism. More so even than existentialism. The Zen Buddhists don't even bother to write books on metaphysics, even on contradictory metaphysics. You see, if Hegel, for instance, wanted to believe in contradictions, being Western, he felt it necessary to construct a whole diabolic philosophic system with the dialectic process and the triads and the absolute and the whole business to justify it. Western mystics, ever since the time of the Greeks, have had to disguise and to some extent justify their irrationalism. But the Oriental mystics are not bothered by overt, naked, plain, simple irrationalism. They have not yet reached the stage intellectually where irrationalism is an issue. They don't feel any need for super dialectics to justify their illogicality. They just come out and say they're illogical. And Suzuki puts this very elegantly. He says about Zen Buddhism that we don't bother constructing higher dialectics. We, quote, content ourselves with just calling a spade a not spade. Unquote. In other words, this is simple-minded, plain, ordinary, Oriental worship of the unintelligible. It's mindlessness of an Oriental dimension. And of course, it's perfectly logical that if this is the direction that the West is going, then the Zen Buddhists, who are the most consistent irrationalists of them all, are going to be the ultimate collectors of the efforts of the existentialists and their associates. Well, our time is running out, and I might add, so is contemporary philosophy. Because along one route, it dissipated itself into a trivial therapy of allegedly linguistic disorders. And along another route, it is now running dry in the swamps of Oriental mysticism. Well, what is to be the future, and is there hope? Tune in next week. Thank you. There's one that came in and asked me if I'm familiar with the work of a psychiatrist named Lang, which I'm not, so I can't comment on that. And it also asked, why is Ayn Rand's Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology inaccessible to the general reading public? It isn't inaccessible to the public. It's available at the Objectivist, if that was what the question means. Now, I have some left from preceding weeks that I've been carrying around. How does one argue or reason with an analyst on ethical problems when he in principle rejects reason in this sphere? He will play his linguistic game and you will never resolve anything. Well, of course, if someone says that reason is inaccessible, as inapplicable in a sphere, then you cannot hope to argue with him about questions in that sphere, because he denies the applicability of reason. An argument implies the acceptance of reason. The only thing you could do is try to show him that it is possible to establish a rational ethics, and that therefore his whole argument for ethical utterances being non-cognitive is false. Indication of how you do that we'll discuss 2 weeks from tonight when we discuss briefly the objectivist approach to ethics. The analyst would say that when it's a question of ethics, you can argue simply over facts. You cannot argue over values. The way they put it, for instance, two people might appear to have a disagreement about value judgments, which are really a disagreement in their factual beliefs. And in such a case, you can resolve the dispute. You see somebody giving a tongue lashing to someone else, and you say, how horrible, say. And then you discover that they're just rehearsing a play. Well, you had your facts wrong. And by pointing out the correct fact, we can get you to change your evaluation. Now they say, so far as value differences depend upon disagreements over facts, well, we can in principle establish facts and therefore in principle resolve those disputes. But if it truly is an evaluative difference, so that your fundamental values differ, not simply the facts, if it's like John Galt versus Albert Schweitzer, or Adolf Hitler versus George Washington, then on that level they say there's nothing whatever that can be done, and consequently you have to take them at their word. You cannot argue with them. Then another question on ethics from last week. Regarding ethics, is it because of emotive reasoning and theory that there are so many social metaphysicians? You're a bad boy. The boy later wishes to become a good boy in order to get social recognition, not because he actually knows the difference between good boy and bad boy. I would say no in answer to this question. That gives too much credit to the logical positivists and their heirs, who have not had a very profound influence on the public at large. They are merely one more voice in the long stream of voices advocating subjectivism and irrationalism in ethics. And they simply are cashing in on the attitude of all these preceding philosophers. If you want to talk about the cause of social metaphysics on a cultural scale. Now, of course, in any individual case, it would be explicable psychologically, which is not our province here. But if you want to look at it on a cultural scale, I'd say the real cause of social metaphysics on a broad cultural scale is Kant, because he's the one that made that the fundamental way of approaching the universe and introducing the social version of the primacy of consciousness, that the group's consciousness creates reality. And you've seen the innumerable ways in which that attitude penetrates down to later philosophers. That's the real philosophic underpinning of the wave of social metaphysics. In the literal sense, Kant's metaphysics is a social one. The metaphysics of the phenomenal world depends upon society. Mankind as a whole creates and determines the nature of the world. So I would put much more philosophic responsibility on Kant, certainly, than on the positivists. Now, one on Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein starts by asserting that some uses of language aren't descriptive of reality, but he appears to end up asserting that all uses of language aren't descriptive. How does he justify this jump? To my knowledge, he does not make this jump. He prides himself on not being monist, not being what he calls reductionist, not taking any one model as the correct model for the use of language, and consequently he says there's nothing common to all uses of language, and some uses of language are descriptive. If I say here now green, or there now waving, or whichever, then I am making a statement which would be descriptive of some actual sense experience, and he would not prohibit, by my understanding, language from being used in that way. So his view, there's nothing common to all uses of language. Do you want to try to intermix some of these? Does Kierkegaard believe in heaven and hell? If so, how does man get to heaven, presumably where God is, without a rational code of ethics to guide his choices and actions while he is on earth? I don't know personally whether he believed in heaven and hell or not. As an ardent Christian, it's no more absurd than the other things he believed, and if his belief in absurdity is the criterion, presumably he should. But why do you need a rational code of ethics to get to heaven? By his view, supposing he does believe that you go to heaven, by his view, the thing to do to get to heaven is to have faith. And to have faith means to believe in the absurd, to be irrational. You're assuming that his God is a follower of Aristotle, and that before God will let you into heaven, he says, I want to see your passport. Have you lived a rational life? Now, there were some followers of Aquinas who took this view under the influence of Aristotle, but a Kierkegaardian would say the more irrational you are, the more you believe in the absurd, the more you gain entry into heaven. Well, that's a good question. When Sartre's free will theory, when man achieves essence, does he then lose his free will and become determined, since he is now defined, limited, identified? I think he would have to say, to the extent to which he creates himself into something from his basic premise, if you have identity, that limits you, so that you are constantly in process of limiting yourself and making yourself determined. However, I believe he also intimates at places that you can, to some extent, undo the results of your previous creation and recreate yourself. Since he says over and over, man is freedom. He is his acts. He suggests in places that you never really become anything very specific, that you're always like a Heraclitean flux in process, and you can recreate yourself into something else. But if the implication is if you were consistent, I don't know how you could be consistent on a view, one of whose fundamental tenets is inconsistency, but if you were consistent on this view, I would think you would have to say, once you become something, you lose your free choice. But of course you could raise the question, if he's nothing, how can nothing do anything, including choose himself? But you can't press these views to that extent. What is the objectivist position, if any, on the problem of the void? The problem of the void is presumably the problem of, is there any nothing in the world? Now, this is, strictly speaking, a question for physics more than for philosophy. So I will simply state briefly that my own view on this question is that there is no such thing as an absolute vacuum. If by a vacuum we mean a total absence of anything, a complete zero. I believe that Parmenides in the ancient world gave a perfectly unanswerable argument against the view that there could be such a thing as an absolute vacuum. His basic principle is what is, and what is not, is not. There is no nothings. And that you cannot, the only thing that exists is something. And that consequently the world is solidly packed from one end to the other with something. Now, what it is that it's packed with, please do not ask me, because I'm not a physicist and I do not approve of philosophers physicizing from an armchair and putting forth theories about the physical nature of the world without specific observational evidence. I'd simply say I don't think the concept of absolute emptiness is a valid concept, and that there is something which occupies what we presently call a vacuum, which simply means the absence of detectable matter as we presently understand it. But I would not go beyond that to try to specify what it was. There were physicists, of course, in the 19th century on this same track, and they called it the ether, which was supposed to penetrate everything, but that's a question for physics. Does the cliche ignorance is bliss originate with Schopenhauer's state of nirvana? I don't think so. I don't know where that originates, but I never heard that ascribed to Schopenhauer. Is Ayn Rand or you planning to write about propositions or universals at any time in the future, or is such a work in the planning stage, or has it been done by either of you in detail? The only thing available at the present time on the question of propositions and universals is Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, which I referred to earlier. Certainly, I expect someday to write a book which will, or more than one, include a detailed discussion of this, but at what point I could not say. Certainly, speaking for myself, it's not in the planning stage, and I do not know that Ms. Rand has present plans in that direction. What is one, a general philosophical question, what does one answer someone who, in answer to your stating that things are indeed black or white, not gray, says, simple-minded solutions are for simple minds? Oh. Well, to begin with, do you understand, when you say that things are black or white, you are there speaking in a moral context, because if you're talking about the law of the excluded middle, the law of the excluded middle says everything is black or not black, but it does not say everything is black or white if you're talking in the literal sense, because there is gray, red, purple, orange, green, etc., and all the other colors. So the first thing I'd suggest is that you make clear what you're advocating, but assuming that you've made clear that you are advocating the view that a thing is either something or it isn't, and you are at that point told that you are simple-minded, and that's the answer. That is simply a person substituting abuse in place of argument. And the only thing you do, if you continue at all, is point out that ad hominem is a fallacy, and that an attack on you of that sort is entirely irrelevant. And if the person wishes to give some argument against your view, what is it? If he has no argument, then let him recognize that he's uttering arbitrary proposition, and you don't deal with him further. I don't know what the question wants. You want some devastating quip that will stop him. There is no such thing for people who think in such cliches as simple-minded solutions. You get the same thing on politics, or you can give complex argument in favor of capitalism, and people say, well, you're just nostalgic for the old days. I mean, such a grotesque, bizarre, ludicrous irrelevancy. There's such personal vituperation instead of argument that the only thing you can do is point that out if you continue at all. Is Schopenhauer considered a forerunner of existentialism? I think he should be. Although he is not commonly mentioned among the sources of existentialism, he was, I guess, not really irrational enough. He was, after all, influenced by Kant. He ascribed to a version of Kant's categories. He had a whole overall philosophic system, and he was, in that respect, still in the traditional view, and the existentialists are very opposed to system building. Whereas the ones that they like write in shorter, isolated fragments. It does not add up to an overall metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, etc. Schopenhauer, in a way, is too grand scale for the existentialists, and for all of his pessimism, you know, he is called philosophically the arch pessimist. He is really not morbid enough for the existentialism. It would be out of his style to talk about nausea and fear and trembling and so on. he had a little more poise and self-composure living in the 19th century than the ones today who run off about these things. Now, if you ask me in a deeper way, is he a forerunner? Well, certainly he is, because all of these 19th century romanticists are forerunners of existentialism, which is just a 20th century version of romanticism. It's the same basic type of philosophy, that something other than reason gives you insight into reality. He's a forerunner of it in his voluntarism. He's a forerunner of it in his view that life is hell. So in a great many ways he is certainly in fundamentals a forerunner, but he is not one of their favorites that they pick out. If man having a specific nature does not imply determinism, why does objectivism hold that man as a being possessing instincts as well as intellect would be deterministic? By instinct I mean motivational drive such as seeking to attain identity as opposed to alienation, stimulus as opposed to boredom, and security as opposed to anxiety. Well, now, to begin with, you couldn't possibly say that any of those things are instincts. Seeking to attain identity as opposed to alienation, stimulus as opposed to boredom, security as opposed to anxiety. I am not clear at all what you mean by instinct here. Those are supposed to be examples of it, but what is supposed to be meant by instinct is some unlearned and automatic form of behavior which is inbuilt in you and which dictates how you will function. Well, if man were run by instincts, then obviously he would be determined. He would have no choice about his values or goals. The drives inborn in him would inspire him to act in ways necessitated by those particular drives. So if his instincts are such as to dictate his behavior, obviously he would be determined. There's one thing to say, having a specific nature is compatible with having freedom. But that doesn't mean that having any nature is compatible with having free will. If your nature were such as to be determined, obviously you wouldn't have free choice. If your nature was to be simply a collection of atoms and molecules bombarding one another according to the laws of mechanics, then you would simply be a determined mechanism in which everything you did would be determined by the laws of mechanics. You'd have a specific nature, and in that case, the specific nature would be such as to prohibit you having any free choice. The same would be applicable here. So I was not maintaining that anybody who believes that man has a specific nature, regardless of his concept of man's nature, is thereby advocating or capable of advocating free will. You have to believe that man has a specific type of nature, namely a specific type of consciousness, a volitional consciousness derivative from a certain type of brain and nervous system. If you don't believe that, then obviously you will land in determinism. Now I have a couple from last week. Since usages are entirely arbitrary, how should we regard the recommendational utterances of ordinary language philosophers? Do these philosophers expect us to heed their advice, or do they expect us to note the rules of their linguistic game? Well, to begin with, the real ordinary language advocates say that they do not make recommendations. It is not their function, they say, as philosophers to tell us how we ought to speak, but simply to identify the nuances, the methods, the manners in which people do speak, and show how traditional philosophers have been confused by this. But the real ones say, we leave everything as it is. We alter nothing. We make no recommendations. Now, of course, it's true that insofar as any of them go beyond that and do make recommendations as to how people should speak, then, of course, by their own viewpoint, since all language utterance is simply playing a game, they too are simply playing a game, and it's just their game, and there's no reason why you should follow their game. So if that's the implication, I agree with it. Now I have one here from last week on which I'll say something and then we'll draw a line. What is the, no, this is not, this I've carried around for weeks now, but I want to say a word on it at least. I think it was from the lecture on Marx. What is the objectivist explanation of how mental events come to affect physical matter, i.e. the nervous system, independent of physical determinants of the functioning of the physical mechanism upon which consciousness depends? This is, in a word, the so-called problem of interaction. The so-called problem of interaction is a problem which arose from the philosophy of Descartes. Descartes proceeded to define mind and matter in ways which made it inconceivable that the two of them should ever be able to influence each other. Mind was defined as non-spatial, non-physical, non-extended. It was a special type of entity which was not located at any point in space. And matter was defined as simply physical extension, spread outness in 3 dimensions, which functioned only on physical contact. And then the question was, how could mind possibly influence matter? In other words, once you set up the two of them in such a way that by their nature there's no point of contact between them, you then have the problem of how does one affect the other. Now, objectivism does not accept the Cartesian interpretation of these. The simple facts as far as philosophy are concerned are simply this. Human beings have a faculty of consciousness. That much you can establish on philosophic grounds. They have a faculty of free choice. You can establish that on philosophic grounds. And their conscious content is capable of influencing their physical behavior. That, as a simple fact, you can also establish on simply philosophic grounds. The simplest way to do it is to show that the alternative is simply self-refuting. If consciousness cannot affect matter, that means that no one who speaks can say that his thought is determining the motion of his mouth. That means that the clacking of his tongue against his uppers is simply a physical jostling caused by preceding jostlings and so on all the way back. And you clack your tongue one way because of the laws of mechanics operated on you that way, and I clack mine another because of the way it operated on me, and nobody can know anything. In other words, if you deny the ability of consciousness to influence matter, meaning here your physical body, you are simply severing the connection between your mind and your mouth or your hand, and you are saying you have lost all standard, thereby all justification for claiming any truth to the content of what you utter or what your hand does. So the fact of consciousness being able to affect matter, in the case of each person's body, is established. Now, if you ask me, how is this possible, I would like to ask, why is that a philosophic problem? Now, of course, if you define those terms as Descartes does, then you have a problem. But objectivism does not have any view on the question of what are the ultimate constituents of consciousness and or of matter. Do they all have something ultimately in common? Is there some ultimate type of energy of which consciousness is one form and matter is another, and in the process of interaction, consciousness gets converted into that type of energy, which then connects the circuit to matter, etc. Objectivism has no such view for the very simple reason that, I mentioned in connection with another question earlier, it is not the province of a philosophy to dogmatize on questions outside the province of philosophy. If you want to pursue such questions as, are there forms of matter beyond what we have already discovered in physics? Is consciousness some type of energy or super energy? Is there some third or fourth phenomenon of which consciousness is one form and matter is another? Those are questions to which philosophy as such has no specific means of answering. Those are questions for physicists, psychologists, biologists to resolve, and it's improper to speculate on the basis of lacking evidence. All you can do as a philosopher is simply say this: any fact which exists is a natural fact. an explicable fact. It is a natural fact that consciousness exists and that the content of your thought influences your behavior. I see no reason a priori why this should be impossible. I don't see anything in the nature of consciousness to make this impossible, nor any reason why this is a problem if you're not trapped in the initial Cartesian definitions of it. But if you ask me to give you some theory of physics, psychology, and biology combined, which will give you some X-ray vision of reality beyond, on this question, beyond what I've said, I'd say it's not in the province of philosophy, but I reject the implication that there is some baffling mystery regarding the interaction of these two. All right, let's stop here and continue next week.
This course continues with Lecture 11.